Chapter 26, World War II. Section 4, War in the Pacific. Because of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, it left the United States Pacific Fleet weakened, and they could not respond to any Japanese advance in Asia. So Japan will advance and conquer places like Thailand, which is right here, where you see the word Siam, that's Thailand. Burma, which is now called Myanmar. The British colony of Hong Kong, which is about right there. Singapore, which is down here at the tip of Malay. And the U.S. territories of Guam, which is right here, and Wake Island, which is right here. Plus all these other areas in red. Those were the places that the Japanese had conquered. The Japanese will then attack the U.S.-controlled islands of the Philippines, who had American General Douglas MacArthur in command of U.S. forces. The Philippines will enter and basically pretty much beat up the American and Allied forces on the Philippines. More than 70,000 Americans and Filipino soldiers will surrender to the Japanese. Those who surrendered in March of 1942 were forced to march 63 miles up a peninsula called the Bataan Peninsula to prison camps. While on these forced marches, more than 600 Americans and 10,000 Filipinos will die, what became known as the Bataan Death March, either through brutal treatment by the Japanese or just the climate and conditions that they were forced to march in. Douglas MacArthur, as he was fleeing the Philippines, vowed that he would return. I'll be back. The Allies were fearful that the Japanese might attack places like India or Australia or even the United States mainland next. So a guy named Chester Nimitz will be put in charge of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, and he was determined to stop the Japanese advance. Now, there were code breakers, American code breakers, who were able to break Japanese codes in order to discover what the battle plans were for the Japanese. So by breaking these codes, they knew that some imminent attacks on islands such as New Guinea were coming. In the Battle of the Coral Sea, which is right here, Japanese planned assault on a place called Port Moresby, which is right here on this island of, this is New Guinea right here. Port Moresby is right here near the tip. And if you notice, it's only a few short miles from the coast of Australia. A victory here by the Japanese would be a launching pad over into Australia, an invasion of Australia. So this was basically a naval attack or battle. So American and Japanese aircraft carriers and fighter planes clashed with no clear victor. But the key here to this battle was that the Japanese advance into Australia was stopped. And in case you don't know what an aircraft carrier is, they're large boats that carry airplanes. And so basically it was an air battle and naval battle. Now, even though there was no land invasion into Australia, there were some attacks by Japanese airplanes along this coast of Australia. But the key was that no invasion happened by the Japanese. The next battle was the Battle of Midway, and Americans again broke a code that said that the Japanese had planned a surprise attack on Midway, which was an American territory. And so the Japanese start their attack on June 4th, 1942, and they start bombing the island. Now, as these Japanese planes go back to their aircraft carriers to refuel, that's when the United States will launch its airplanes and attack the Japanese aircraft carriers. So in those attacks, American bombers destroyed 4 carriers and severely weakened the Japanese Navy in this victory. After the victory at Midway, this is where the Allies start recapturing Japanese territories. And in August 1942, a very key battle involved an island called Guadalcanal. Now, if we're looking at this map, Guadalcanal is right here. This battle saw intense fighting that lasted for nearly 6 months. part of the problem, besides the enemy bombs, of course, and the bullets, were the hot, rainy jungles of this island. Soldiers suffered from diseases such as malaria. They were hungry due to the lack of supplies. But it was an Allied victory. With the victories at Midway and Guadalcanal, the Allies developed a new strategy called the island hopping strategy. Island hopping is when Allied forces took only the most strategically important islands instead of each Japanese-held island. It might take a while to capture every Japanese-controlled island, so they only picked strategic islands to attack. So if you're looking at this map, you would see some of these strategic places such as Gilbert Island, Marshall Island, Mariana, Volcano, and Bonin Islands. So if I can blow this up a little bit, you can kind of see what I'm talking about here. So you have the Solomon Island right there. There's Solomon. Gilbert Islands. The Marshall Islands. There's Mariana Islands right there. Solomon Islands. You can see through those this map all the different places. Now you didn't see all the islands captured, just strategic key ones. In October of 1944, General MacArthur comes back to the Philippines to retake it, and in the process, it was the largest naval battle in history to take place. And this was called the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The Allies crushed the Japanese fleet and pushed them out of the Philippines by the summer of 1945. So here's the map of the Philippines, and you kind of see the action that took place there. And MacArthur said he would be back, and he was. He liberated Philippines from Japan. Some of the final battles that took place in the Pacific, one in February 1944 was the Battle of Iwo Jima. The Marines stormed the beaches of Iwo Jima. It was kind of a smaller scale version of the D-Day invasion. You have large ships with the transports coming onto the beaches of Iwo Jima. And it was a month of bloody fighting where 20,000 Japanese soldiers were either killed, wounded, or taken prisoner, and 6,800 Americans were killed. But this is like one of the most famous pictures of Americans putting up the American flag on the top of the mountain there. That flag raising actually happened at the beginning of the battle. It's still a long, bloody month after that flag raising took place until the Allies beat the Japanese on Iwo Jima. This is a story, if you ever heard of the book and the movie called Flags of Our Fathers, it kind of tells you that this action right here was actually a setup. These aren't the original guys who put the flag up, but it was recreated so a photographer could take the picture. Now, Iwo Jima was a deadly battle, but even more deadly battle was on the island of Okinawa. This happened in April of 1945. U.S. forces attacked Okinawa, and this fighting took place for 3 long months. In this battle, Japanese planes used a tactic called kamikaze, meaning they purposely crashed their planes into enemy ships. Many American ships were damaged through kamikaze missions, but they didn't quite have the effect that the Japanese had hoped. Even though they may have sank a few of the American ships, it didn't really do the damage that they had hoped. But there were severe casualties, of course. 48,000 Allied casualties in this battle and 190,000 Japanese casualties. That is the end of Section 4.